Maria
We need to
Santos
move
had
now.
always been the
This is
quiet one
critical.
in her engineering class at Stanford University. While her male classmates dominated discussions and grabbed attention during presentations, she preferred to let her work speak for itself. But sometimes silence wasn't enough. The morning of November 15th started like any other. Maria arrived early to Professor Williams' advanced robotics lab, her backpack heavy with the components she'd been working on for months. Her project was ambitious, a self-learning robotic arm that could adapt to different tasks without reprogramming. While other students focused on basic motor functions, Maria had developed an algorithm that allowed her robot to recognize patterns and improve its performance over time. She set up her workstation in the corner, carefully arranging the circuit boards, sensors, and mechanical parts. The lab slowly filled with her 23 classmates, mostly men who had formed their own tight-knit groups over the past 2 years. Maria had tried to join study groups before, but she often felt like an outsider looking in. "All right, everyone, gather around," Professor Williams called out, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Today we're going to see your final projects in action. Remember, this counts for 40% of your final grade, and I expect to see innovation, technical skill, and practical application." One by one, students presented their work. Jake Morrison showed off his automated sorting system that could separate different colored blocks. The class applauded politely. Sarah Chen demonstrated her voice-controlled wheelchair navigation system, which earned impressed nods from everyone. Then came David Park with his robotic pet that could follow simple commands. Each presentation lasted about 10 minutes, with students explaining their code, demonstrating functionality, and answering questions. Maria watched nervously as her turn approached, running through her presentation in her mind for the 100th time. Maria Santos, Professor Williams finally called. She wheeled her project to the front of the lab. Her robotic arm looked deceptively simple compared to some of the flashier projects, but Maria knew its true power lay beneath the surface. She had spent countless nights in this very lab, debugging code and fine-tuning sensors. "I've developed what I call an adaptive learning robotic arm," Maria began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Unlike traditional programmed robots, this one learns from each task and improves its performance automatically." She demonstrated by having the robot attempt to pick up various objects, a pencil, a coffee mug, and a regularly shaped stone. With each attempt,
We
the
have to
robot's
move now.
movements became
There's
more
no time to
precise
wait.
and efficient. The neural network I've implemented allows it to recognize grip patterns, weight distribution, and optimal approach angles, Maria explained, showing the real-time data on her laptop screen. After just 5 attempts with any new object, it can achieve a 96% success rate in manipulation tasks. The room was quiet, but not the good kind of quiet. Maria noticed several classmates exchanging glances. Jake Morrison leaned back in his chair with a skeptical expression. David Park whispered something to the student next to him. "That's quite impressive, Maria," Professor Williams said, examining the robot more closely. "Can you walk us through the algorithm?" Maria launched into the technical details, explaining the machine learning frameworks she'd modified and the custom sensors she'd integrated. She showed flowcharts, code snippets, and performance metrics. Her presentation was thorough and well-prepared, but as she spoke, she could sense growing doubt in the room. Jake Morrison finally raised his hand. "Maria, this is pretty advanced stuff," he said, his tone carrying a hint of disbelief. "I mean, the kind of adaptive AI you're describing, are you sure you didn't just modify some existing open-source code?" "No, I wrote this from scratch," Maria replied firmly. "I can show you the development timeline and my version control history if you'd like. It's just that David Park joined in. Companies like Boston Dynamics spend millions developing this kind of technology. It seems unlikely that someone could create something this sophisticated as a class project." Maria felt her cheeks burn. She had anticipated technical questions, but not accusations of dishonesty. "I understand it might seem complex, but I've been working on this for 8 months. I can explain any part of the code you'd like to see." "Maybe you had help," suggested another classmate, Tom Bradley. "Like, Maybe someone in the PhD program helped you out? There's nothing wrong with getting assistance, but we should be honest about it. The implications stung. Maria had worked entirely alone, staying up until 3 in the morning most nights, surviving on coffee and determination. She had taught herself advanced machine learning concepts that weren't even covered in their coursework. "No one helped me," she said, her voice growing stronger. "This is my work, my code, my design." Jake Morrison sat forward. "Okay, but can you actually prove that? I mean, anyone can claim they wrote something. Can you show us you actually understand how it works?" Professor Williams looked uncomfortable but didn't intervene. The unspoken challenge hung in the air like a storm cloud. Maria realized this wasn't just about her project anymore. It was about whether her classmates believed she was capable of producing work at this level. "Are you asking me to prove I wrote my own code?" Maria asked quietly. "Well," Jake shrugged, "if you really did create this, then explaining it shouldn't be a problem, right? Like really explaining it, not just reading from prepared notes." The room fell silent. All eyes were on Maria. She could see doubt, curiosity, and in some faces, barely concealed skepticism. These were the same classmates who had dismissed her ideas in group discussions, who had never invited her to study sessions, who had always assumed the quiet girl in the corner couldn't possibly be the most talented person in the room. Maria looked around at the 23 faces staring at her. Some seemed genuinely curious about her explanation. Others appeared to have already made up their minds that she couldn't have created something so advanced. Jake Morrison sat with his arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone who expected to be proven right. "Fine," Maria said quietly, her hand steady as she saved her presentation and opened her development environment. "You want me to prove it?" She could feel her heart pounding, but her voice remained calm. Years of being underestimated had led to this moment. Years of being overlooked, dismissed, and doubted had prepared her for exactly this challenge. "I'll prove it," she said, turning toward her laptop. "But when I do, I want everyone in this room to remember this moment." The lab fell completely silent. Outside, students walked across campus, completely unaware that in this small robotics lab, something significant was about to happen. Maria's fingers hovered over her keyboard as she prepared to demonstrate not just her technical knowledge, but her right to be taken seriously as an engineer. Professor Williams glanced at his watch. There were still 45 minutes left in class. More than enough time for Maria to either vindicate herself completely or face humiliation in front of her peers. "Where would you like me to start?" Maria asked, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Jake Morrison leaned forward, convinced he was about to expose a fraud. "Start from the beginning. Show us how the learning algorithm actually works. And don't just read code comments. Explain the logic behind every decision." Maria nodded slowly. She had spent months developing this system, debugging every line of code, optimizing every algorithm. She knew this project better than she knew anything else in her life. "All right," she said, pulling up her integrated development environment. "Let's begin with the neural network architecture." As her fingers began moving across the keyboard, opening files, and pointing to specific functions, Maria felt a familiar calm settle over her. This was her element. This was where she belonged. The room remained silent, but now the silence was different. It was the silence of anticipation, of 23 people about to witness something they hadn't expected. Maria Santos was about to prove exactly who she was. Maria's fingers moved across the keyboard with the confidence of someone who had written every line of code herself. She pulled up her neural network implementation, the core of her adaptive robotics system. "The foundation is a modified convolutional neural network," she began, highlighting sections of code on her screen. "But instead of using standard backpropagation, I've implemented a custom learning algorithm that adapts in real time." She pointed to a function called adaptive weight update. This is where the magic happens. Traditional neural networks require massive data sets and offline training. Mine learns on the fly. Jake Morrison squinted at the screen, trying to follow along. "That's just standard tensor operations," he said dismissively. "Look closer," Maria replied, scrolling down to reveal more complex code. See this matrix transformation here? I'm not just updating weights based on error gradients. I'm using a prediction verification loop that factors in physical feedback from the robot's sensors. She ran the code in debug mode, showing how variables changed in real time. When a robot attempts to grasp an object, it makes a prediction about the optimal grip pressure based on visual input. Then, it compares that prediction to actual sensor feedback from its joints and fingertips. Dr. Williams stepped closer, his eyebrows raised. Maria, this is quite sophisticated. You're essentially creating a closed-loop learning system. Exactly, Maria nodded, opening another file. But the real innovation is in how I handle unexpected objects. Watch this. She placed a crumpled piece of paper in front of the robot, something it had never encountered before. The robot's camera focused on the object, and Maria's code sprang to life on the screen. Variables updated rapidly as the algorithm processed visual data, made predictions, and prepared motor commands. The robot reached for the paper, initially grasping too hard and crushing it slightly. But immediately, the learning algorithm kicked in. Maria pointed to her screen where error values were recalculating. See? The robot just learned that this object requires a lighter touch. If I place another piece of paper in front of it now. She crumpled a second sheet and placed it nearby. This time, the robot approached with noticeably gentler movements, successfully picking up the paper without damaging it. That's impossible, David Park said. Learning that fast requires massive computational power. Your laptop can't handle that kind of processing. Maria smiled for the first time that day. You're thinking about traditional deep learning. But I'm not using a massive network. I'm using a smaller, more efficient architecture that I designed specifically for this application. She pulled up another file showing her network topology. Instead of the thousands of nodes typical in deep learning, her network had only 127 nodes arranged in a unique configuration. I realized that for robotic manipulation, you don't need to recognize millions of different objects like a vision system does. You just need to understand a few key physical properties: weight, texture, fragility, and shape category. So I designed a network that focuses specifically on these attributes. Tom Bradley leaned forward, studying the code. But how did you train it initially? Even a small network needs training data. I generated my own training data, Maria explained, opening a folder containing thousands of images. I spent 2 months in this lab after hours, recording the robot's attempts with hundreds of different objects. Every success, every failure, every sensor reading. She showed them video clips of herself working alone in the lab at night, methodically testing the robot with various items: books, tools, food items, electronic components. Each clip was time-stamped, showing months of dedicated work. I manually labeled every interaction with the physical properties I mentioned. Then, I used this data to pre-train the network before implementing the real-time learning capability. Jake Morrison's confident expression was beginning to crack. Okay, but the machine learning algorithms you're using, those are well-known techniques. You didn't invent neural networks. You're absolutely right, Maria acknowledged. But innovation isn't always about inventing something completely new. It's about combining existing technologies in novel ways to solve specific problems. She opened her research folder, revealing dozens of academic papers she had studied. I read everything I could find about adaptive robotics, real-time learning, and sensor-motor integration. Then, I identified the gaps between what existed and what I needed. Dr. Williams was now completely absorbed, studying Maria's code intently. Maria, can you explain how you handle the temporal aspect? Learning from sequential actions is notoriously difficult. That's where my background in signal processing helped, Maria replied, opening yet another file. I treat each manipulation attempt as a time series problem. Instead of learning from individual snapshots, my algorithm considers the entire sequence of actions leading to success or failure. She demonstrated by showing the robot how to open a bottle cap. The first attempt failed. The robot couldn't generate enough torque. But instead of just increasing force randomly, the algorithm analyzed the entire sequence: the initial grip angle, the rotation speed, the pressure distribution over time. Traditional approaches would just increase the gripping force. Maria explained as her code processed the failure. But my system recognized that the problem was grip angle, not force. Watch the second attempt. The robot tried again, this time adjusting its initial grip angle slightly. The bottle opened smoothly. Sarah Chun, who had been quiet until now, raised her hand. Maria, this is incredible work, but I have to ask, how did you learn all this? These aren't concepts we've covered in class. Maria paused, considering how to answer. I've been teaching myself advanced topics since freshman year. While y'all were at parties or hanging out, I was usually here in the lab or in the library. I love this stuff. The honesty in her voice was unmistakable. Jake Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I've always felt like I had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously, Maria continued. So I did. I read academic papers during lunch. I watched MIT lectures online instead of Netflix. I chose to spend my spring break last year at a robotics conference in Boston instead of going home. She pulled up her browser history, showing months of research into advanced topics. Conference papers, video lectures, technical forums where she had asked questions and received answers from PhD students and industry professionals. You want to know how I learned all this? Maria said, her voice growing stronger. The same way anyone learns anything difficult. One concept at a time, one paper at a time, one failed experiment at a time. Dr. Williams nodded appreciatively. Maria, can you show us the testing data? How do you measure the improvement in performance? Of course, she replied, opening a spreadsheet with thousands of data points. I've logged every single manipulation attempt for the past 3 months. Success rates, time to completion, accuracy measurements, error classifications. The data was meticulously organized. Charts showed clear improvement curves for different object categories. The robot's performance with familiar objects had plateaued at around 96% success rate, but its ability to handle new objects had steadily improved. This is a proper experimental methodology, Dr. Williams observed. Control variables, clear metrics, statistical significance testing. Maria, this is PhD-level research. I wanted to make sure my conclusions were valid. Maria said simply, if I'm going to claim my robot can learn, I need data to prove it. Jake Morrison was now studying the screen intently, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. The performance curves. How do you explain this plateau at 96%? Why not higher? Maria appreciated the technical nature of the question. Physical limitations of the hardware, mainly. The servo motors I'm using have finite precision, and the camera resolution imposes limits on visual recognition accuracy. With better hardware, I think I could push it to 99% or higher. She opened another document showing her analysis of failure cases. Each failed attempt was categorized and explained. Most failures were indeed due to hardware limitations rather than algorithmic problems. You've thought of everything, Tom Bradley said, sounding impressed despite himself. I tried to, Maria replied. When you're working alone, you have to be your own peer reviewer. I questioned every assumption, tested every hypothesis, validated every claim. The room had grown quiet again, but this was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of people reassessing their assumptions, of minds being changed, of respect being earned. Dr. Williams glanced around the classroom. Does anyone else have questions about Maria's technical approach? David Park raised his hand tentatively. Maria, I owe you an apology. This is clearly your work, and it's brilliant. I'm sorry I doubted you. Me too, said Sarah Chun. This is easily the most impressive project any of us has done. Jake Morrison remained quiet for a moment longer, then spoke up. Maria, I was wrong to question your work without understanding it first. This is really something special. Maria felt a wave of emotion she hadn't expected. For months, she had worked in isolation, driven by her passion for robotics, but wondering if anyone would ever recognize her abilities. Now, finally, her classmates were seeing her for who she really was. But she wasn't finished yet. She had one more thing to show them, something that would demonstrate just how far ahead of the curve her thinking really was. "There's one more feature I want to demonstrate," Maria said, her confidence now unmistakable. "Something I haven't shown anyone yet." She reached into her backpack and pulled out what looked like a second, identical robotic arm. "Individual learning is impressive," she said, connecting the second robot to her system. "But collaborative learning is revolutionary." The second robotic arm hummed to life as Maria connected it to her network. The room, which had already fallen silent with amazement, seemed to hold its collective breath as she prepared for her final demonstration. "What if I told you," Maria said, positioning both robots side by side, "that when one robot learns something new, it can instantly teach that knowledge to another robot?" She placed a complex object between the two arms, a delicate glass ornament with an irregular shape and multiple protruding elements. It was clearly something that would require careful handling. "Robot A has never seen this object before," Maria explained, gesturing to the first arm. "It's going to attempt to pick it up and learn from the experience. Robot B is going to watch and learn from Robot A's attempt without ever touching the object itself." The first robot extended toward the ornament, its sensors analyzing the complex surface. Maria's screen displayed the real-time decision-making process, the algorithm calculating grip points, pressure estimates, and approach angles. The robot's first attempt was cautious but imperfect. It managed to grasp the ornament, but held it at an awkward angle, causing a small decorative element to rattle against the main body. "Robot had just learned something important about this object structure," Maria narrated as data flowed across her screen. "It learned that this object has loose components that require extremely gentle handling." Then, something remarkable happened. Before Robot A had even finished placing the ornament down, Robot B's status indicators lit up. Data was transferring between the two systems. "Robot B just received everything Robot A learned," Maria explained. "Not just the successful grip pattern, but the understanding of why certain approaches failed." She moved the ornament to Robot B's workspace. Without any trial and error, the second robot approached the ornament with precise, confident movements. It grasped the delicate object perfectly on the first attempt, with exactly the right pressure and angle to prevent any rattling. Dr. Williams stared in amazement. "Maria, you've created a distributed learning system. This is beyond anything I expected to see in an undergraduate project. How is that possible?" Jake Morrison asked, his earlier skepticism completely replaced by fascination. Maria opened a new section of her code. "Each robot doesn't just learn for itself. It learns for the entire network. Every successful manipulation creates a knowledge profile that gets stored in a shared database. When a new robot encounters an unknown object, it can access the collective experience of every robot that's come before." She demonstrated further by introducing a third object, a soft foam ball. Robot A learned to handle it with minimal pressure. Immediately, Robot B could handle identical objects with the same delicate touch, despite never having attempted the task itself. "This has applications far beyond just these two robots," Maria continued. "Imagine a factory where hundreds of robots share knowledge instantaneously, or a space mission where rovers on different parts of a planet can learn from each other's discoveries." Sarah Chun raised her hand, her voice filled with awe. "Maria, this is commercial-grade technology. Companies would pay millions for this kind of system." "I know," Maria replied quietly. "I've already filed a provisional patent application." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Dr. Williams looked stunned. "You've patented your work?" "My advisor at the Innovation Center helped me with the paperwork last month," Maria explained. She said the collaborative learning algorithm was novel enough to be patentable. "I've also been in contact with 3 robotics companies about potential licensing deals." Jake Morrison sat back in his chair, looking completely overwhelmed. "Maria, I don't know what to say. When I questioned your work earlier, I had no idea." "You had no idea what I was capable of," Maria finished for him, her voice calm but firm. "None of you did. And that's exactly the problem." She turned to face the entire class, her confidence now radiating from every gesture and word. For 2 years, I've sat in these same seats, listening to the same discussions, working on the same projects. But somehow I was invisible. When groups formed for study sessions, no one thought to invite the quiet girl. When project partnerships were discussed, everyone assumed I didn't have anything valuable to contribute. The room was uncomfortably quiet. Several students looked down at their desks. I'm not angry about it, Maria continued. But I want you all to understand something important. Innovation doesn't always come from the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it comes from the person who's been quietly working while everyone else was talking. She gestured toward her robots, still positioned perfectly on the demonstration table. You asked me to prove I wrote this code. You asked me to prove I understood these concepts. You asked me to prove I was capable of doing work at this level. Her voice grew stronger with each sentence. But here's what I proved. I'm not just capable of doing work at this level. I'm already working several levels above it. Dr. Williams stepped forward. Maria, I owe you an apology as well. I should have recognized your potential earlier. This work is extraordinary. Thank you, Professor, Maria replied. But I don't need your recognition to validate my abilities. I need your recognition to ensure other students like me get the opportunities they deserve. She began packing up her equipment, her movements efficient and confident. The real test isn't whether I can prove my worth to a room full of people who already doubted me. The real test is whether this room full of people can learn to recognize worth before it has to be proven. Tom Bradley raised his hand hesitantly. Maria, what you've accomplished, it's incredible. But why didn't you ever share your progress with us? We could have learned from you. Maria paused in her packing, considering the question. How many times did any of you ask about my work? How many times did anyone in this class show genuine interest in what the quiet girl might be developing? The silence that followed was telling. I share my early ideas during class discussions, Maria continued. Remember the debate about real-time learning algorithms 3 months ago? I suggested that adaptive networks might be more practical than static ones. Jake, you said it was theoretically interesting but practically impossible. Jake Morrison's face reddened as he remembered the conversation. Or when we discussed collaborative robotics, and I mentioned the possibility of knowledge transfer between units. David, you said it sounded like science fiction. David Park nodded slowly, the memory clearly returning to him. I learned early on that sharing my ideas with this class meant having them dismissed or ignored. So I stopped sharing and started building instead. Dr. Williams looked around the classroom. This is an important lesson for all of us. We need to create an environment where every student feels heard and valued. It's not just about feeling heard, Maria corrected gently. It's about being taken seriously. There's a difference between listening politely and actually considering that someone might have valuable insights. She finished packing her equipment and stood up, her presentation officially complete. Maria, Sarachin called out as she headed toward the door. Would you be willing to share your research with us? Maybe lead a study group or something? Maria turned back, studying the faces of her classmates. For the first time in 2 years, she saw genuine respect in their eyes instead of polite dismissal. I'll think about it, she said, but understand that any collaboration would be on equal terms. Not me teaching you, but all of us working together as peers. Of course, several students said simultaneously. As Maria reached the classroom door, Dr. Williams called out one final question. Maria, what's next for you? Have you thought about graduate school? She smiled, the first genuinely happy expression she'd worn all day. Actually, Professor, I've already been accepted to the PhD program at MIT. I start next fall. My advisor is Dr. Rodriguez in the AI lab. Dr. Carmen Rodriguez? Dr. Williams asked, clearly impressed. She's one of the leading researchers in adaptive robotics. I know, Maria replied. She saw my work at the robotics conference I mentioned earlier. She said my collaborative learning approach could revolutionize industrial automation. With that, Maria Santos walked out of the classroom, leaving behind a room full of students who would never again assume they knew what someone was capable of based on how loudly they spoke. 3 weeks later, Maria received an email that would change everything. The defense robotics company that had been reviewing her patent application wanted to license her technology for autonomous military systems. The licensing deal was worth more money than her parents had earned in their entire working lives. But, more importantly, she received another email the same day. It was from Dr. Rodriguez at MIT, asking if she would be interested in presenting her collaborative robotics research at the International Conference on Intelligent Robots and Systems. The girl who had once been invisible was about to become one of the most sought-after young researchers in her field. 6 months later, when Maria won the National Collegiate Inventor Award for her adaptive robotic system, the auditorium was filled with hundreds of people applauding her achievement. In the front row sat her former classmates from Dr. Williams' lab, cheering louder than anyone else. Jake Morrison later said it was the most important lesson he learned in college. Never underestimate someone based on their silence. Sometimes the quietest people are working on the loudest innovations. Maria's robots now serve in manufacturing plants across 3 countries, learning from each other and sharing knowledge across continents. But she never forgot the day when a room full of people asked her to prove herself, and she turned their doubt into respect with nothing but her own brilliant mind and tireless dedication. The girl they had overlooked became the engineer they would all aspire to be.